Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second in our tank destroyer week. And we are no closer to answering that question of what is a tank destroyer? When does a tank destroyer become a tank? And when does a tank become a tank destroyer? And when does an artillery piece become a tank destroyer? But we don't care if we're not answering those questions. My guest is Pete Blanchard. He has been on a couple of times before talking about Spanish Civil War and what have you. But today we're talking about the StuG. So I'll bring Pete in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Yep, fine. All good.
So we just thought about before going live there, you know, we were discussing, it was quite a few weeks ago, the idea behind this, maybe months ago. And you said, oh, I'll do the StuG. How difficult was it putting this together in the terms of knowing when to stop with the spider's web of things that evolved from the StuG?
Yeah, it wasn't as simple and straightforward as you'd imagine. You know, it's quite a wide-ranging topic. You think it's simple at the beginning. It's a very straightforward vehicle if you look at it from sort of development point of view, and then the more you look into it, the more rabbit holes appear in front of you, and it's which ones do you pick, which ones do you leave.
You know, and even with just the vehicle types, that's one layer of complications. How they were then used and deployed is another whole level of complication, because I can think in Norma, they were clearly used as tanks by some arguments, and they were clearly used as artillery by some arguments. So it's a myriad of a labyrinth of potential rabbit holes. So I've said rabbit hole early, folks. That means you can start drinking right away at the beginning of the show. But Peter's come armed with a fantastic PowerPoint. He's going to take us all through it. We will do questions as we go along, but bear in mind that we may not have got to the bit you want to talk about yet. So if it's a particular model or type or variant, we probably will be getting to it at some point. So don't kind of preempt too early. But if it's about the vehicles we're talking about, then fire away. But assume that there are others coming up later on. But yeah, we will welcome your questions. But basically, over to you, Pete.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, before I kick off, a couple of disclaimers. One relevant to what we've just discussed there. Firstly, to any native German speakers, I apologise in advance for the butchery I'm about to deploy upon your language. And secondly, because I've only got an hour and a bit really to discuss the whole topic of the Sturmgeschütz, the question, you know, I'm not going to get into the real deep detail. So if you're coming here hoping to find out the exact date when the second radio buzzer was actually, you know, put onto the superstructure of the vehicle, you might want to dial down your expectations now rather than later. So what are we going to be looking at this evening? Kind of splits nicely into four parts. First of all, we'll talk about what was the Sturmgeschütz. We'll talk about its origins, its development, production, and its evolution. Then we'll be looking at the early campaigns in which it took part, the Low Countries in France, 1940, the Balkans, and the USSR with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. Then what I've intriguingly called the years of transformation and expansion. Two crucial years, 1942-43, where we see things happening around the Sturmgeschütz that its original planners probably hadn't envisaged. And then lastly, we'll look at the last 2 years of the war and also look at the other Sturmgeschütze. So that's what we're going to be looking at over the next hour or so. So moving to the first question, what was the Sturmgeschütz? I could be completely facetious and say, well, it's one of those. What is one of those? It's a German medium tank. It's got an armoured superstructure or casemate on top of it instead of a turret, and it's got a powerful gun in it. That's, in a nutshell, what a Sturmgeschütz was as a vehicle. Perhaps more controversially, these are also all Sturmgeschütze, and at least one of those photographs is guaranteed to raise a few eyebrows, and I'll do my best to bring them back down to a normal level later on. But yeah, we'll be covering all of the vehicles on here this evening.
Cool.
So, where did the idea come from? Who came up with the concept of taking the turret off a tank and putting a casemate on? For that, we have to go all the way back to World War I, with the advent of what I've called tracked armoured fighting vehicles. So as most people tend to be aware, but I'll quickly touch on it, armoured fighting vehicles with tracks were invented really to break the stalemate of the static warfare that had been around since late 1914. And it's not until you get to late 1915, early 1916, the boffins in France and Britain are looking to come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful vehicles which are going to, rip holes in the barbed wire in front of the enemy trenches and cross the trenches and this and that. But it's not until the middle of 1916 the British produced their land ship, or tank as it's known. And in September, at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the British initially deploy their tanks for the first time. About 7 months later, the French do the same with their Schneider CA1 on the bottom left-hand corner, the rather ungainly Saint-Chamond in the top right-hand corner. And these are very slow, armoured, lightly armoured, really, assault vehicles. They're not great in defence, they're not particularly manoeuvrable on the battlefield, and they're certainly not fast. But what they are good at is roughly what they're set up to do, and that's to plod ahead over the barbed wire, over the trenches, causing havoc and supporting the infantry as they advance. So they kind of do what they're supposed to do. Germany, however, is a bit behind the game on this. They've already seen this technology before the First World War starts up. 1912, they get hold of a Holt agricultural tractor from the US, one that's got tracks instead of the real wheels. They look at it and dismiss it as not having any value for the military. It's not until the British turn up with their tanks that they suddenly have to rethink the whole way of thinking on this. They then come up with a really accelerated development and production program for their own tank, the A7V, the glorious lump of metal down in the right-hand corner. Technologically, really well advanced, but extremely unstable on anything other than a sort of level battlefield. They only produce 20 of those, so they have to rely really on a lot of captured vehicles. But the one thing the Germans do is a slightly different concept. They come up with the concept of the Begleit-Batterien, the so-called escort batteries. Now, what these are, they are small units or small detachments of light artillery, which are either manhandled into place or towed behind horses. They're brought up in response to the infantry saying, we've got a problem here, we're being held up by a machine gun nest or whatever. They're able to be brought up quickly, deployed, and direct their fire onto the target, eliminate that to allow the infantry to continue the attack. A lot quicker, a lot easier than phoning back or sending a carrier pigeon back to your artillery a kilometre or so behind the lines, hoping they'll hit the machine gun post in question. So the Germans find this is a very effective method for supporting the infantry. Now, fast forwarding about 20 years, I'll quickly fast forward onto the next slide. Now, in 20 years, quite a lot has happened in terms of technology. Tank armour has improved. You're no longer limited to riveting armour plate onto a big frame. That still happens. I mean, the little tank in the top photograph at the front, the Panzer 38, was built along those lines. But the Germans and the Soviets were now looking at using welded armour to produce lighter tanks because you don't have a frame to rivet things to. Armament also, that's being developed. You're no longer relying on the older guns from 20 years previously. New types of weapons are coming on board. And probably most importantly, certainly as regards what we're talking about tonight, the internal combustion engine. That's been developed quite a lot in the prior, well, since 1916 and the first tanks arrived from the battlefield. You've now got power plants which you can fit into vehicles. Instead of going at 6 kilometers an hour across a battlefield, you can now go at 40 kilometers an hour. Okay, probably along a road, but even so, it's a lot quicker than what you had 20 years previously. The engines are also much more reliable, and require much less maintenance. You're able to get further. You've got a much wider range. Some of the tanks now can reach well into 3 figures, so 120, 150, 200 kilometers without the need for major maintenance and refueling, whereas you're probably talking under 50 kilometers for a First World War vehicle. So the game's really changed as regards to mobility. Now, there was a lot of conservative thinking in the military, not in any particular one country, but in general. A lot of folk looked at the tank and said, well, it's the result of an aberration. We won't be doing static warfare anymore. That was a mistake. We won't be making that mistake again. So why would we need tanks? Others accepted the fact that the tanks existed and that they could be used effectively, but they were seen as subservient to the infantry. The infantry is number one, artillery and tanks are number two. They're there to support the infantry. But it's those enlightened individuals, again, not just in one country, but Soviet Union, Britain, and obviously for the purposes of tonight, Germany. They looked at this and said, okay, we know where we are with the armament and the armor. The mobility is giving us a real advantage. If we can come up with our armed forces moving at the same speed as the tanks, so if we can send them up a road at 40 kilometers an hour, the infantry, artillery, reconnaissance, engineers, anti-tank crews, all traveling at 40 kilometers an hour, that's got to be a lot better once you break through the lines than having foot soldiers moving at walking speed. And it's the likes of Guderian, the likes of von Manstein in Germany, who managed to take this philosophy, this concept forward, and it becomes, if you like, the winning concept, and the Panzer Division as we know it is born. But the question then arises, if you've got tanks which were originally devised to break through a static kind of environment with trenches and things, if they're now going off driving around the countryside at 40 kilometers an hour, doing fast things, who's supporting the poor old slow infantry? And that was a question which, again, was being asked in various countries. Now, the British, as we know, they came up with the concept of the infantry tank. So you had the Matilda 1, Matilda, all the way through to the Churchill. The Germans decided they didn't want to. They wanted to keep tanks separately. The tanks, we're going to do tank things, but we need something else to do the infantry support. What is it? And it's this von Manstein chap. He's only a colonel in 1935, but he puts together a proposal which says that Germany should return to the concept of the Begleit battalion. It should, these escort batteries, it worked well in World War I, and we should do the same now. But let's not have horses carting these guns around. Let's mount them on vehicles. Let's armor the vehicles so they can get close enough to the enemy to be really effective. And we'll put them on tracks from a mobility point of view. That's what we should be doing. Now, that idea gets a lot of traction, and it's generally accepted as, yes, this is the way to go. To have small numbers of dedicated armored vehicles deployed as mobile artillery to deal with these obstacles for the infantry, such as machine gun posts or anti-tank guns or what have you.
And just to jump in for a moment, Pete, this whole 1930s period, we've talked about it before on the channel. We've had various guests on talking about British tank development, German, Russian, so and so. Isn't it a little bit like trying to predict in advance how to play rock, paper, scissors, in that any one of the three can be winning or losing depending on what the enemy are going to do? And in this 30s period, all of these doctrines are being developed without really knowing what potential enemies doctrines are going to be doing. So therefore, how do you know if you're going to get the right one or not? Or do you just be so strong with yours that you control the world?
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult one. And the 1930s, as I've touched on already, from a technology point of view, again, you've got all sorts of weird and wacky ideas happening. It's a case of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks from that point of view, almost.
Yeah.
What works, what doesn't. In terms of doctrines, well, I'm sure a lot of the intelligence agencies were doing or working overtime trying to work out who was doing what. And bearing in mind, you know, you were still able to go and, you know, military attaches were still sort of being invited to sort of inspect each other's armies, etc. In fact, there's a rather good story about the Sturmgeschütz, which I'll quickly throw in here. That once they actually got the prototypes up and running, in what was it, 1939, this was, there was a visit from some Soviet military attaches, even though the prior collaboration had really stopped, they were still visiting each other. And what happened was they visited the artillery base at Jagdpanzer in Germany. And they were, you know, they're there to see artillery being used and being sort of shown around the place. And they accidentally caught sight of some of the Sturmgeschütz prototypes. They sort of drew up, and it was a case of, oh bugger. They couldn't suddenly sort of say, oh, sorry, you're not allowed to look at those. You know, that, you know, they weren't allowed to do that. So the Soviets whipped out their cameras, took a picture of these strange vehicles, and carried on. What the Germans did was to take them then through another part of the base where they quickly set up an X-ray machine and got them to all walk in front of the X-ray machine and wipe their camera film. Now, you've got all of this sort of stuff going on. But yeah, going back to what was the right doctrine, I think a lot of it was the case of, you know, how well, you know, do we think this is going to work when we know that the Soviets are kind of doing this, the British are doing this, the French are doing that. But yeah, you're right. It's a real period of trial and error.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Right, the last point I was going to make on this particular slide was the fact that the whole concept of this new mechanized escort battery idea had been accepted. Fine, that's great. The only people who sort of stroked their chins and looked at it and said, actually, we have a bit of a question about this, were the armored troops, the Panzertruppen. They looked at it and said, well, hold on. This is a gun on a vehicle which is armored, on tracks, and looks to all intents and purposes like a tank. That's kind of our stuff. This is what we do. The artillery responded by sort of saying, well, no, just because it's on a tracked vehicle with some armor plate on it, you know, it's doing artillery things. We did this in the First World War. We'll do it in whatever comes up in the future. It's an artillery thing. It's core, you know, our core competence. The artillery win the argument, and the idea goes ahead. So the concept is given the thumbs up. What about the vehicle? What is it going to look like? How do they take it forward from here? Well, Manstein had already had some thoughts on this. He said it's going to be tracked, it's going to be armored, it should be open top to give the crew the widest possible observation, view of the target, should have a wide traverse, should have a powerful gun, etc. Now, those ideas were refined and taken forward. The open-topped idea quickly disappeared. Crew protection suddenly became much more important. And they started to add other requirements, such as it should be no taller than a standing man, about 1m70, 1m80. You know, a nice low profile, keep it as hidden as possible from the enemy, and that's the way they were doing it. They wanted reasonably thick front armor, so anything that would stop what they said at the time a 2cm caliber shell. So you're looking at 30-40 millimeters of armor. Wide traverse, and obviously the gun had to be capable of taking out any expected field fortifications, such as machine gun bunkers, dug-in field guns, or anti-tank guns, etc. Anything that they could expect the infantry to be held up by. And interestingly, even back then, they said it should be capable of knocking out enemy tanks, albeit as a last resort, but it should be able to knock out enemy tanks, because they couldn't rule out an infantry division not coming across enemy tanks as they advanced. So as the Sturmgeschütz is brought in, it should be able to deal with whatever's in its way. So that's the specification, and that specification was then handed over to Daimler-Benz along with a contract to develop some prototypes with a view to producing them. Now, Daimler-Benz actually had they did actually have a contract to produce the hull of the Panzer III. So, not wanting to reinvent the wheel, makes perfect sense. They based the new vehicle on the chassis of the Panzer III. Curiously, they gave it the working title, amongst a couple of others, of the Schwere Panzerabwehrkanone, or SPAC, the heavy anti-tank gun, which was curious for something which is only supposed to take on tanks as a last resort, but that was the name given to this vehicle. They built 5 of these SPAC prototypes in late 1937, 1938. There's one obviously in the photograph there, and the eagle-eyed amongst you who are familiar with what this thing looks like once they start producing them will look at that and think, hold on, there's something not quite right with those little road wheels between the big sprocket at the front and the big idler at the back. Those of you with access to an abacus will also note that there are 8 and not 6, which is the usual number of road wheels associated with the vehicle. The reason being is that the first 4 models of Panzer III all had experimental suspensions. The first one had 5 large road wheels. The second, third, and fourth had these 8 little road wheels with various combinations of leaf springs, just to sort of see which was going to work best for this particular medium tank. As it happens, none of those were, and we end up with 6 road wheels on each side on torsion bars. But what you've got here is one of the Sturmgeschütz prototypes on one of these early Panzer III. So it looks like a Panzer IV chassis, but it's not. It is indeed a Panzer III. Goes through various trials, tests. Few little things are ironed out, problems and niggles. But it goes into production at the end of 1939, December, only to find that as they put it on the new model with the 6 road wheels, the gun mount doesn't fit because it kind of clashes with the new transmission they put in there. The casing's in the way. So a quick bit of last minute engineering ensures that in January 1940, the first ones come out the factory gates at Daimler-Benz, and by May, they've completed 30. Right, so they've got 30 of these. Manstein's idea was to have a battalion of these vehicles for every infantry division. If we go to the next slide there, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll come back to the battalion per infantry division on the next slide or two. This is why it actually comes out of the factory. And it's worth spending a little time, try not to get into too much detail here, but needed to be well armored. That was the specification. It's given 50 millimeters, 2 inches of armor at the front. The tank it's based on, the Panzer III, only has 30 millimeters. The gun it's given is this little stubby 7.5 centimeter gun. I put here it's an L24. Some people will be familiar with this terminology, but effectively, if you divide the length of the gun barrel by the caliber, so however many centimeters it is long, divided by 7.5, gives you this ratio. Here it's 24. Effectively, the lower the number, the shorter the gun. The shorter the gun, the lower the velocity of the shell coming out. So it's got an L24 gun, so it's short and stubby. By contrast, the Panzer III had a 3.7 centimeter gun, but that was an L47, so comparatively longer, higher velocity, and it's really a cannon for making holes in the front of tanks, whereas the Sturmgeschütz one isn't. It has the same power plant as the Panzer III, no change there, and they go roughly at the same speed. No surprise really. The Sturmgeschütz is only about a ton more than the Panzer III, so there's not a great deal in it. So the Panzer III is 19.5 tons, Sturmgeschütz is between 20-21. The last thing I'm going to point out on here is on the diagram. called a Sturmgeschütz Ausführung A. Again, another long, complex looking German word. But if you think of British tanks, the Crusader Mark I, Crusader Mark II, Mark III, Churchill Mark VII, British used numbers to differentiate their versions of the same tank. The Germans used letters. That's all this is. It's effectively the German way then of distinguishing between the first version, second version, etc. So this is the A. Now, in terms of how they were deployed, or they were going to be deployed, in late 1939, they came up with this organization for a Sturm battery of 6 guns, 6 being the usual total for an artillery battery at the time. So 6 guns, 6 Sturmgeschütze. They'd also thought that, okay, we're going to put the battery commander in a little armoured half-track, which has got an armoured roof, extra radio equipment and observation devices. We'll put his second in command in another one and give one of these same little half-tracks, an StuK IV, to each of the platoon commanders. So they've got radio communication device or sets, observation, etc. In each platoon, you've also got the 2 Sturmgeschütze. You've also got another little armoured half-track, a 252, which carries the ammunition. And logically, if you're going to put an ammunition carrier near the front line to resupply your Sturmgeschütze, you really want it armoured. You don't really want to put all your ammunition in an unarmoured truck. So that's what they were wanting to do. And then lastly, they would have yet another type of half-track, a medium 251, to carry around spare crew members in case any of the Sturmgeschütz crews get wounded. So 3 platoons like that, plus signals, supply, maintenance and a workshop. So that's another sort of 15, 16 trucks, cars and trailers, and about a dozen motorbikes on top. So it's a really rich mix of kit that they're using here. Lots of armor, lots of semi-tracked and tracked vehicles.
And just to ask a question, in this, I mean, 2 years from 37 to 39, we start getting to 1940. That doesn't sound very long. But in terms of developments of armor and doctrine, that's a long time. I mean, during this process, has any thought been given to changing the purpose of the StuGs are for? Have other people been interfering in the plan there from this original idea of it being infantry support? Have people been seeing the vehicles and saying, oh, we could use them for this, we could use them for that? What about, couldn't we have them do that? Or has they really stuck to the original idea and concept?
It's the latter. They've stuck to the original idea. I mean, we're now looking at early 1940. The invasion of Poland's happened, but the Sturmgeschütz weren't around at the time for Poland. So nobody else has really seen these vehicles. Unless you've been to the artillery base where they were being used for training and testing, you won't be probably aware that they even exist. So nobody has yet meddled with the concept. Nobody has yet sort of tried to change the ideas behind it. I think we have to wait another couple of years before that actually takes place, but we will get there. So this is the battery setup. 3 of these batteries form a Sturm artillery battalion. And as I mentioned earlier, Manstein had the idea of 1 battalion with 3 batteries per infantry division. Now, bearing in mind that Germany at the time, at the start of the Second World War, had around 90 infantry divisions, 90 times 18, and I'm not going to do any mental arithmetic now, that's quite a lot of vehicles. And as we've seen, they built 30 in 5 months, which is not a great deal. So by the time they get to the proposed invasion of the Low Countries from France, Fall-Gelb, they've only got 30 of these vehicles. They haven't got loads of battalions. So the idea is to use or create a single battalion with 3 batteries, allocate that to an infantry division and do a proof of concept to see if the thing works. Because they've got these ideas of how it should work. Let's see what it looks like in practice.
And just one question, because it came up from a couple of people about the supply echelon, tracked or mechanized?
Motorized. So it's literally trucks, cars, trailers, motorbikes. They're, you know, none of the supply, maintenance, workshop, or the signals vehicles were armored or tracked in any form.
Okay, thanks.
So for the invasion in the West, they're looking at building a single battalion to support one specific infantry division. Plan A quickly crumbles because they suddenly realize that while the Sturmgeschütze are coming out the factory is okay, all of these little half tracks, the command half tracks, the ammunition half tracks, and the troop carrier half tracks, they're just not appearing. So they come up with Plan B. Let's just have 5 independent little batteries on their own. We'll forget about the battalion for now. Again, the supply, these things are dribbling out of the factory gates. They're not coming out. You know, the tap isn't opening. There's no flood of these vehicles appearing. Plan C. Okay, we can't get 5. Let's do 4. And they managed to cobble together 4 Sturmgeschütz batteries for the campaign in the West. 640, battery 640 is allocated to the infantry regiment Großdeutschland. Großdeutschland get these vehicles and immediately take a liking to them and never return them to the artillery. They keep hold of them for the rest of the war and expand them in 1942 to a full battalion. So they kind of disappear off the radar. Battery 659 and 660, they both participate from day one of the invasion, but battery 665 isn't ready until the first week of June and crosses into France on June the 10th. So really, we only kind of know about the experiences of, or it's only 659 and 660 which have a full experience of the whole campaign. And it's an interesting experience. Not a great deal seems to have been written about it because you're only looking at 24 vehicles maximum, 4 batteries of 6 vehicles. Only one is knocked out though, and it's not a total loss. It doesn't blow up and take the crew with it. It's badly damaged, but it's repaired and eventually returned to its unit. But what they do find is where the Sturmgeschütze are used in the way that they were intended to support the infantry, then it works. The infantry are happy with the result. The Sturmgeschütze do what they're supposed to do, and all is well. It's where the infantry, you know, for all of the training that they give the Sturmgeschütz crew and the battery staffs, for all of that training, if the infantry don't know what these vehicles are meant for, they can, you know, you can get some rather awkward misunderstandings. And of course, that you know, no examples of this are noted in the campaign. And what you find is that the Sturmgeschütze are being asked to act as tanks, which is not a good idea. They haven't got turrets. They've got no machine guns. I think the best they have are the crew pistols and a 1 MP40 submachine gun. Not great. You know, no turret. You've got weaker side armor. So if they go ahead of the infantry, they become a prime target, and they're not able to respond as a tank would. So not that was seen as a bit of a problem. But there was some combat versus tanks. At least one of the batteries, 660, sees action against French tanks during May. There's an account by one of the drivers of one of the 6 vehicles in the battery 660, where they come up against a number of French tanks, and the crew is very relieved to find that all of the French tank rounds that are fired at them just bounce off their frontal armor. They're also pleased to find that when they fire their gun at a French tank, they hit a Renault 35 and it takes the turret straight off, like we see in the photograph there. It's a low velocity shell, but 7.5 centimeters flying still at a light tank's turret is not good for the tank commander inside it. So when they did come up against tanks, all was well again. So the first of a few graphs tonight. So I guess it's my third apology to anybody who still suffers from nightmares from maths classes from when they're at school.
We love graphs. People can't get enough graphs. They love pie charts and graphs. They're well trained.
Good to hear. I've tried to keep the numbers to a minimum and tried to keep the terminology to a minimum, but there's lots of nice, colourful, simple graphs. So that should be good. All this does is show the monthly production of Sturmgeschütz vehicles from the first one in January 1940 all the way through to the end of the first production run. When I say first production, the production run of the short-barreled Sturmgeschütz in February 1942. And as you can see, it starts off very low numbers. They get up to about 10 by May, so 10 a month maximum by the time of Fahlgelb. That's also the time when the production is taken away from Daimler-Benz, who are struggling, and it's given to another assembler called Alket. You may well, they're a name associated with a certain Major Becker of Normandy fame. Alket take over production, and as you can see, by September, they really start to ramp up production. They're now at 300% what Daimler-Benz were putting out. And by the time we get to the end of this period in February 42, they're putting out an average of 45 vehicles a month. Not amazing, but obviously a lot better than what had been achieved with Daimler-Benz. But what this does is to give them the ability to actually start creating some of the battalions they were hoping to get created by the time of the campaign in the West. So moving on to the next one, we can see the production moves to Alket post France. You get the formation of the first battalions, the first Sturmgeschütze Abteilungen. So rather than individual batteries, you've now got battalions of 3 batteries. This is how the Sturmgeschütz setup should have been from day one. They're only just managing it now in late 1940. They also take steps to streamline the organisation of the battery. So that nice, very rich mix of armoured vehicles that we saw as a wish list in 1939 is suddenly changed in 9 months later. It's actually got the date of April 41 on there, but it's actually brought up in August, September 1940. They add in an extra Sturmgeschütz for the battery commander. So you now got 7 vehicles per battery, but they eliminate virtually all of the armoured half-track carriers. All of the command ones go. So the battery commander goes into a Sturmgeschütz. His second in command loses his half-track and gets a car. The platoon commanders also get to ride in a Sturmgeschütz now, and because of the extra radio equipment they need as a platoon commander to be able to liaise with battery HQ and the other Sturmgeschütz, the extra 2 radio sets have to be crowbarred in somehow into the vehicle. The existing radio receiver has its own little recess. The extra 2 radio sets have to be fixed to the back wall, which makes for a much cozier ride until they can come up with a modified vehicle later on. So all of the armoured half-tracks, with the exception of the ammunition carriers, because it would be frankly crazy to do away with those, all of the other half-tracks are either disappear or are made into unarmoured ones. So that's what happens in late 1940, very early 1941. Then, obviously, we see the invasion of Yugoslavia in early 41. 2 battalions of Sturmgeschütze are deployed. They don't see any action. The fighting's over before they can get near the front. So they get some experience in sort of deploying in columns, but that's about it. For Greece, again, another 2 are deployed in Bulgaria. They cross the border into Greece with the infantry divisions that they're supporting. And one of the things the commanders of the battalions complain about is the fact that it's not ideal country for their vehicles. They're going through the mountains, narrow mountain roads. They really unhappy about this, but they do take part in supporting the infantry as they assault the Greek defences. but it doesn't last long. Greece surrenders, and the Sturmgeschütz are moved back out. Where the Sturmgeschütz units do see a lot of action is later on in 41. 22nd of June, as we know, Operation Barbarossa commences, and the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. German forces are split roughly into 3 groups: army groups, north, centre and south, and as you can see there, each are given a slightly different level of support from Sturmgeschütz units. So you've got Sturmgeschütz units operating all the way from Leningrad in the north, all the way down to Sevastopol in the Crimea. And the thing with Barbarossa, as people may well be aware, is that whereas Poland, France and the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, Greece are relatively short campaigns of a matter of a few weeks, Barbarossa's a totally different ballgame. Barbarossa itself as a campaign lasts 6 months until December 41, and then obviously grinds on for years after that. It's not a case of fighting for 4 or 5 weeks, then going back to base for refits and overhauls of engines and stuff. All of this stuff's got to be done in the field. They're there for 6 months. It's a whole different experience. The experience that the Sturmgeschütz units have, the first one is obviously shared with the rest of the armed forces, especially their cousins in the tanks. Wear and tear on the vehicles. Obviously, there's a lot more mileage being done, a lot more wear and tear on the transmissions, on the engines, on the tracks, on the wheels, etc. All of that has to be taken care of in the field. Supply issues, supply of spare parts, new replacement vehicles, fuel, ammunition. Again, major challenges, not like it was before in France and the Balkans. A problem that the Sturmgeschütz units have is that as they are not wedded to any particular infantry division, they can be called upon by any local infantry unit. They're finding that they're incurring even more mileage because they may well be in the same sector as 2 or 3 infantry divisions, but they've got to spend their time driving between them all. Battalion commanders find it's becoming hard to keep tabs on where their individual 3 batteries are. The whole thing becomes rather problematic. An extreme example is that one particular battalion supported 11 different divisions in only 10 days. Kind of gives an idea of the complexity of what they had to do. As one the Sturmgeschütz commander put it, you know, we are a fire brigade.
Yeah, I was going to say it's similar to that firefighting kind of principle that we've been talking about in World War II TV, and the chieftain may mention it on Thursday, like the cavalry groups, American cavalry groups in 44 and 45 that are kind of plugging in gaps and racing to plug in lines, and the Germans are finding the same thing here. I just want to point out at some point we've got a flurry of questions I'd like to deal with when you reach a convenient break in a minute or two, and then we can carry on.
Okay, let's get to the end of this slide and then break for those. Yeah. Okay. The third experience point, or the third thing of note, is what we saw in France. You've got well-trained Sturmgeschütz crews, well-trained battalion and battery staff, understanding what they should be doing, how they should deploy, etc. But what they find is a lot of the infantry just don't understand the concept of the Sturmgeschütz. It's never been explained to them, and they see them as tanks. And as I've mentioned before, when that happens, bad things tend to happen. Combat versus tanks becomes the norm in the USSR in 1941. You've got lots of light tanks still around. So while they're not a problem for the Sturmgeschütz, I mean, a 7.5 centimeter shell, even from a low velocity gun on a Sturmgeschütz, can still make a mess if it hits an old T-26 or a more modern T-60 or a BT-7. It's when they start to come up against the heavy KV-1 tanks, the T-34 with its sloped armor. Suddenly the Sturmgeschütz crews realize that their armor piercing shells are just bouncing off of these monsters. same experiences with the tanks. Where the Sturmgeschütze are, it's, put it this way, it's not a disaster for them. It's a pain. But what they find is that because they have this low profile, they're able to avoid detection until fairly late on. So they can start lobbing lots of high explosive shells at these. And that's what does the damage. They're managing to sort of cripple these tanks by blowing off tracks or blowing off wheels or hitting the engine deck. So while it's not an absolute disaster, it's not, you know, they're going through a lot of high explosive shells trying to cripple these tanks to actually deal with them. Interestingly enough, conversely, they're finding out from interrogating Soviet tank officers that Soviet tanks do not like dealing with Sturmgeschütze. They can't see them until kind of it's too late. When they do see them, then they haven't got turrets, so they're fairly small targets, so that they're having trouble hitting them. And when they do hit them, quite often the shells are bouncing off because of the thick frontal armor. So the Sturmgeschütze are not having fun with KV-1s and T-34s, but conversely, the T-34s are not having much fun with the Sturmgeschütze.
Right. Okay.
Right. Questions. What questions?
So there was several questions about production facilities. People saying, did they take over production facilities in France, for example? Were they made at the same factories that made tanks? How many different factories were making them? Were they made in one place? So kind of, if you could deal with kind of that general melee of questions, that would be cool.
Sure. Until, well, certainly for the production run, and we will be touching on this later, so I'll keep it short now because we will be expanding on this later. For the production run of the short-barreled Sturmgeschütz, it was all done by one assembler, Alket. I think they had 3 factories and all, so they weren't just producing Sturmgeschütz vehicles, they were producing Panzer IIIs and other vehicles as well. They had a design facility, so they're also designing other vehicles, even though Alket might not get the production contract. They are based in northwest Berlin. I think that roughly that's all that I need to say at the moment.
Okay.
Because as I say, I'll be touching on this a bit later.
Okay, next one, you may be touching this on this later, is I'll be curious if Pete addresses the long-held fact that StuGs totaled 20,000 AFV kills during World War II. I wonder if that's accurate or total fantasy.
Right, that will be addressed right at the very end.
I thought it would be.
We have got a slide on that.
Okay, and the other one was, I've got to find it now, from Mehdi. Is there a certain preferred distance non-turreted armor like a StuG needs to be effectively to engage targets? I asked due to the limited azimuth the main gun has to engage targets. Was it a problem?
I think the answer to that is that the Sturmgeschütz crews wanted to obviously have as much distance between them and the enemy tanks as possible within the effective range of their gun. Of course, it all comes down to the effective range of the gun of any vehicle. There's no point in trying to engage tanks at 2,000 meters if your gun is only effective up to 1,500 meters. But if you've got a gun which can reach 2,000 meters, then, you know, if you know that the enemy's gun can only reach 1,500 meters, then obviously you want to use your range advantage over the enemy. So it's a case of engaging the enemy as far out as possible within your effective range. And, you know, I don't think that's something which is, exclusive to the Sturmgeschütz crews.
No, I mean, and I think this kind of connects with this is where Madcat is asking about, did the Russians copy the StuGs with their introduction of the Su-76 or Su-85? And again, we're into that kind of rock, paper, scissors, is that both forces are looking at what the other one's doing and thinking, how can we copy what they're doing, but limit what they're doing to us? It's a constant kind of almost like a chess game, I suppose.
I had thought about that. I've not looked into it too far. I mean, the Soviets did have turretless, self-propelled guns before World War II breaks out, or the Great Patriotic War for them, before that breaks out. Were they influenced further by the appearance of Sturmgeschütz? Short answer is I don't know. Off the top of my head, I don't know. It's something I was thinking about looking into, but I didn't in the end because, you know, this
how long do you spend on that?
Exactly.
And the other thing is already coming up is have they become tank destroyers now? Have they gone away from the original concept of them? At what point and this is this whole role changing thing, which brings us to the Great Dominion's question: is did StuG gunners use indirect plunging fire to engage the thinner upper armor of Soviet tanks, which is another type of role? So this is this whole complex of issue of when is a tank and when is a tank destroyer self-propelled gun. But did they use indirect fire?
They use first of all, they use bracketing to range themselves in on the Soviet tanks. So, you know, literally fire one shell which they knew to be further away, and then one shell in front, and then they would get the distance from there. Would they actually use it sort of mortar-like to actually put the shells on top? No. I mean, these are direct fire weapons. They're not high velocity weapons. So yes, there is a, you know, more of a curve to the shot. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, and I've not seen anything in reading through all of the literature on this, I've not seen anything that specified that was the way in which they try to get or try to deal with tough targets like the KV-1 or the T-34. I think it literally was still employing, you know, relatively direct fire.
Okay, no problem. We'll do some more questions later on because I fear we're going to get stuck. But I'll hand back to you.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Excuse me. So these are, if you like, a lot of the main points of, you know, if you like, the experience gathered by, or the points experienced by the Sturmgeschütz crews in 1941. What I'm going to do now is move on to 1942. And if you remember back to the contents slide at the very beginning, I mentioned that 1942 and 43, we're talking about transformation and an expansion. And I'll expand upon this now so you understand what I mean. So 1942, things start to happen to the Sturmgeschütz. First of all, a new long-barreled gun is put into production in early 1942. They take the then Model E version of the Sturmgeschütz and they put in this new long-barreled gun. Langhor is apparently German for long barrel, so it's the long-barreled version. I put new in inverted commas because it's not an entirely new gun. The gun, they actually began development of this before the Second World War. Now, there's probably some document somewhere in some archive somewhere which says who gave the authorization to start developing this and why, because it was clear from the start that the brief of the Sturmgeschütz crews was not to engage tanks unless attacked by tanks as a last resort kind of thing. But a high velocity gun was development of a long high velocity gun was developed before the Second World War, or it started before the Second World War. They were looking at an L40, L41 length of gun, so considerably longer than this little L24 that they eventually go ahead with. It's developed through 1940, 41, and towards the end of 1941, it's put in for trials and testing. It's then compared to another gun, very similar gun, again, both 7.5 centimeter in caliber, the new anti-tank gun being prepared, the PaK-40, which may be familiar to a lot of people. Both guns are compared to each other, and the PaK-40 is notably superior. So rather than fit a defective gun, they try and come up with a hybrid, taking the best of the PaK-40 and putting it on the Sturmgeschütz version. What they do, they take the barrel, which is perceived as the weak part on the Sturmgeschütz gun. They take the PaK-40 barrel, put it on the cartridge chamber and breech of the Sturmgeschütz gun, and they've got their new long-barreled gun. It's an L43 gun, so a bit longer than what they've been anticipating. Goes into testing, it's fine, it works. So that goes into production in the early 1942, and lo and behold, all of a sudden, these new long-barreled Sturmgeschütze are capable of putting holes in the front of T-34s and KV-1s. That's not all of the good news for the Sturmgeschütz crews. Sorry, that was an unintended rhyming there. There are a lot of Sturmgeschütze still out in the field with short barrels. They're going to be out there because the plight isn't to suddenly ramp up production and replace all of the Sturmgeschütz with short barrels. They're only sending out long-barreled versions to replace losses in the field, or where a particular unit is called back to Germany for complete refitting. I think the first of the refits is actually Großdeutschland, who expand into a division and get a full battalion of these long-barreled Sturmgeschütze. But the short-barreled Sturmgeschütze get this new ammunition, heat ammunition or heat shells, nothing to do with temperature, nothing to do with hot. Stands for high explosive anti-tank. I'm not going to go into the technology behind it, but it allows low velocity shells to puncture the thickness of armor that you normally need a high velocity gun for. It's the same technology as you'll find in bazooka rockets and Panzerfausts. It's that kind of thing. If you look on Wikipedia, it'll explain it in glorious technical detail. So
great.
Look out for the Monroe effect on there. So they get this new ammunition. It's not perfect. It's not as good as having a long barrel, but it's certainly much better than the useless armor-piercing shells that they've got when it comes to dealing with these heavier Soviet tanks. Hitler then also decrees that the Sturmgeschütz must have 80mm of frontal armor. The Germans are aware that they've come up against these heavier Soviet tanks. They need to respond. They need to have tanks that can deal with these. So they're going to obviously come up with things like the Tiger, the Panther. And they're not daft. They know that the Soviets will not let them just develop that. So the Soviets will come up with heavier things. So, you know, you see the KV-85 and the IS-2 coming out in later on in the war. So the tank arms race really sort of kind of kicks in here. And as part of that, Hitler says 80mm armor on the front of the Sturmgeschütz. It may slow it down, but I don't care. That's what they should have. Now, Alket can't just ring up the armor plate supplier and say, excuse me, can we have 80mm instead of 50 from now on? You know, you've got to make sure that the supplier can actually produce effective armor of the same quality at that extra thickness in the same quantities, etc. That doesn't happen overnight. So you're going to have an interim period whereby that armor isn't available, it's in development. So what they do is to continue building Sturmgeschütze with 50mm of armor, but the front plates, they put an extra 30mm front plate on the front of these vehicles. So sort of the lower front plate and the little front plate on top of that, the glasses. They weld them at the beginning, but they soon realize that quite often when they're hit, these welded plates will either crack or fracture or splinter in some way. If they're welded on, you've then got to try and get the plates off the front of the vehicles and then put new ones on. So they actually end up bolting them on, which are much easily, you know, replacing a broken plate is therefore made much easier. So you've got this up armoring, you've got the long barrels. As we can see on the graph at the bottom, while the little blue bars, which are the short barreled ones, as we can see, March 1942, they kind of switch over to producing the long barreled versions, and Alket starts to up production. They start to, you know, they turn the dial up to, try and get it up to 11, and try and get the production up to about 120, 130 vehicles a month. Still not where they want it to be, but again, these are now much more effective vehicles, and you know they're coming out at a better rate than before. And the last point on this slide, they come up with the final iteration, the final version of the Sturmgeschütz, the Model G. The main difference here is the superstructure. It's bigger, so therefore you've got much more room inside. It's wider. You can fit much more ammunition inside. You've got room for these extra radio sets for the commanders. It's got a cupola on top, so rather than stick his head out, the commander can now stay well within the vehicle, and by looking through the prismatic periscopes on the inside of the cupola, which for the most part rotated, he's got a 360-degree view of the battlefield. Now, it's the final version. There is no HIJK, but of course they continue to develop and add extra features to this through till the end of the war. For example, in the photograph, you've got one there with the additional armor skirts on the side to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifle fire. Other features such as smoke dischargers, the Zimmerit, they put a machine gun on top, some get a second machine gun in the Madler, etc. So there are constant improvements being made, but it's the final Sturmgeschütz vehicle or version. So all of this happens in 1942. You've got an improvement to the armor, a better gun, you've got better ammunition for your short-barreled stuff. More of them are coming out of the factories, and now you've got this brand new version with an improved superstructure. All of that has an effect, and the effect is one of expansion. The expansion is also facilitated by the fact that end of 1942, the vehicle on which this is based, the Panzer III, it's coming to the end of its life. They've upgunned it from a 3.7 centimeter gun to a short 5 centimeter gun to a long 5 centimeter gun, and then they fit some with the short 75 millimeter. But it's a vehicle whose armament is no longer cutting the mustard on the battlefield. They can't really deal with the KV-1s and the T-34s, as well as these long-barreled 75 millimeter guns. So the decision is taken to stop production of the Panzer III around about the end of 42. And of course, what that does is free up manufacturing capacity to build the Sturmgeschütz. And as you can see from the graph in the right-hand corner, those orange bars suddenly start ramping up massively. A second assembler, apart from Alket, is brought in, MIAG. They've also been producing Panzer III, so they've again freed up capacity to start building these assault guns. Now, I mentioned the Model G was the last model to be made, and that's true. But what they do, they take the Model G and they fit in a 10.5 centimeter howitzer, just to give an extra bit of oomph, to use a technical term, to the Sturmgeschütz battalions. This is the normal howitzer, which is employed by most normal German artillery battalions at the time. They fit this into the Sturmgeschütz. It's obviously it's not a Sturmgeschütz, it's not an assault gun. This is now an assault howitzer. So it's called the Sturmhaubitze 42, 42 being the year of design. Still referred to as a Sturmgeschütz because it kind of still is, but those are represented on the graph by the little green bars. They start to appear in 1943. So production of those starts in 43. And what they do, they deploy those to the Sturmgeschütz battalions, and they give 3 to each Sturmgeschütz battery. So you're now looking at 7 with guns, 3 with howitzers, and they find that that is a very good ratio with which they can operate. Now, last but not least is this fourth bullet point. The long-barreled Sturmgeschütz, which is now an L48, so twice the barrel length of the original Sturmgeschütz with a little stubby gun. The improvement on the Sturmgeschütz has not gone unnoticed by a lot of people. I'm not talking about the artillery or the high command or the Austrian corporal. The other people who the Sturmgeschütz, who are now seeing these Sturmgeschütz on the battlefield, are looking at these and thinking, now, these are things we could make great use of. And indeed, that's what happens. You see, if you think about what anti-tank guns, or more, not so much anti-tank guns, but anti-tank units are using for vehicles, they're using the light tank hunters, the things like the Marder II, the Marder III. And what these are, they're light tanks with a superstructure put on top and a powerful, normally a PaK-40 anti-tank gun or the captured Russian equivalent. They're being used as mobile anti-tank vehicles. And what happens is people like the Panzer divisions and the Panzer Grenadier divisions, the Waffen-SS, are looking at the Sturmgeschütz and thinking, hold on, that has got the same gun as what we're using on our little tank hunters, but it's got much less of a profile, it's much lower, much harder to detect, and it's got 50mm, well, now 80mm of armor on the front. Whereas you hit one of our things with a T-34 shell and our little tank hunter goes pop. So can we have some Sturmgeschütze, please? Likewise, because of the increase in production, they now look at giving infantry divisions, not all of them, but a large number, giving infantry divisions their very own Sturmgeschütz company. So they're not reliant upon the fire brigade battalions coming around to help them out. Even the Luftwaffe get in on the act. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division wants some Sturmgeschütze as well, and some of the other ground units too. So the Luftwaffe want in on this. And they even they even feel comfortable with the way that production is going up and up and up, that they can spare enough to give, or sell in most cases, to their allies, such as the list there: Bulgaria, Italy, Hungary, Romania, and even to Spain, which isn't even taking part in the conflict. So suddenly you've got this expansion of customers for the Sturmgeschütze. Now, I mentioned the Panzer divisions and that their anti-tank vehicles were these light Marders, etc. But what happens at the end of 42 when the Panzer III goes out of production? The Panther hasn't started production, and it's not used until the Battle of Kursk in the middle of 43. So from the end of 42 to the middle of 43, there are not a lot of tanks coming out of the factories, apart from the Tiger, which is allocated to specific units. It's only the Panzer IV. To remedy this, 100 Sturmgeschütze a month are allocated to Panzer divisions and Panzer Grenadier divisions to be used instead of tanks. And not just in an anti-tank battalion, but as within the Panzer regiment. Got a couple of examples there. Apologies, it's not particularly visible. I'll read it out just to save people's corneas. On the left, you've got the status report for September 1944 for the 12th Panzer Division, specifically for the Panzer Regiment. They've got one active battalion, which should in theory have 4 companies of Panzer IVs. If you look at the list of what they're actually operating with in the regiment, they've got 47 Panzer IVs, which is enough for 3 companies, and they've got a company of 17 Sturmgeschütz IIIs. So they've literally replaced a company of tanks in the regiment with a company of Sturmgeschütze. Similarly, 16th Panzer Division, a year earlier in September 43, they've got a Panzer regiment with 2 active battalions. Battalion 2 is using Panzer IVs, as was normal, but Battalion 3 has got 3 companies of Sturmgeschütze as well. So it's effectively got a battalion of tanks, a battalion of assault guns instead of tanks. So what you've got by the end of 43 is the humble little infantry support assault gun being used as an assault gun by the Sturmgeschütz units under the artillery. It's being used as a tank hunter by anti-tank units within infantry divisions, Luftwaffe divisions, SS divisions, Panzer divisions, and Panzer Grenadier divisions. And it's even being used in place of tanks by the Panzer divisions. the key fact here, or a key fact here, which kind of sort of really brings this home, is that by the end of October 43, just over half, and there's that awful 52-48 split again, just over half of all Sturmgeschütze go to the Sturmartillerie. Nearly half of all production is being given to other branches of the armed forces.
Now, is this because they're proving their worth, or it's because there's lots of them available, or a combination of both those factors?
It's a combination of both. You've got this increase in production. By October 1943, if we go back to the graph, there we go. October 1943, they produced 384 Sturmgeschütze in 1 month. So production is really ramping up here. So availability is, is enabling the supply of these vehicles to these other branches of the armed forces, and indeed to other nations. And the reason they're doing that is because it fulfills the requirements of the vehicles that the other branches want to use. They haven't got enough tanks, and this thing can adequately just about serve as a tank. It hasn't got a turret, which isn't ideal, and that's the biggest bugbear for the tank crews. It has got a turret, but the gun is as good as what they've got on the Panzer IV. It's the same gun, effectively. For tank hunters, it's better than what they've got in terms of the Marders. You hit this thing with a T-34 shell, you're not guaranteed you're going to do much damage at all. You hit the front of a Marder 3 and, it's going to be a bit messy. So it really is a combination of both factors. Availability, because of the increased production, and it's a vehicle which is proving its worth. It's got good armor, pretty good mobility, and a very good gun. So it really is, your second point, it's a combination of both factors.
And the fact is, it now has got more than one defined role. This whole ongoing problem this week of when is a tank destroyer, we've muddied the water more by this point than we have getting any closer to an answer to that question.
Yes, I mean, if you're looking for an answer to that question by means of the Sturmgeschütz, I think you're probably going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
But it is a measure of the strength of the vehicle at this point in the war that it's being requested by more and more different branches of the armed forces to fulfill more and more different roles.
Yeah.
Right, back to the graph. This is when we last saw it. It's a bit bigger, so it's a bit more visible for people. So as before, blue bars, short-barreled, orange bars, long-barreled, and the little green sprouts of howitzer. What we got going up to October 43. If we now expand this graph until April 45, which is when production effectively ends, we can see that. Now, I guess the first thing most people's eyes will be attracted to is the larger or the longer bars of green in 1944. Howitzer production really takes off during 1944, so there's a lot more green there. And in fact, if you look at April 1945, the very last month of manufacture, the last 48 Sturmgeschütz 3s that are produced are 48 howitzers. But that's not the only interesting thing on the graph. The thing that grabs your eyes is what's being pointed out by this rather menacing purple question mark. November 1943, production crashes from the high of 384 vehicles all the way down to under 250. So you're looking about 230. What happened? Production has effectively fallen off a cliff. If we now look at the graph in a slightly different light, so I'm not going to change the length of the bars, they'll stay the same, but the colors will change. Instead of looking at this in terms of short-barreled, long-barreled, or howitzers, I'm going to look at it in terms of assemblers, manufacturers. So if you look at the very beginning, you've got this sort of coffee-coloured few bars where it's at Daimler-Benz. That turns into the dark blue of Alkit production through until the end of the war. And then the light yellow is MEAG coming in early 43. But if you go back to October 43, where you get this big decrease in production, you can see that the MEAG production stays the same. The length of the yellow bars doesn't change. It's the length of the blue bars at Alket. Something happens at Alket to cause this drop in production. And drop is a good word because it's a load of Allied bombs which drop on the Alket, one of the main Alket factories in Berlin. 23rd of November 1943, there's an air raid, causes a lot of damage. 3 days later, the bombs fall again, 2 air raids within a week, and production is severely curtailed. A lot of the vehicles in the assembly halls which are being put together are either, well, they're mostly destroyed or wrecked. And the guys at Alket have now got to report up the chain that what is now specified as a high priority production item for the war, because it's not just artillery using this now, it's the panzer divisions, it's that big list of people we saw before, infantry divisions, the SS. One of their main sources of this vehicle has now been badly damaged, and then it's going to take them a long time to get back up to the same levels of production in, well, as it was literally the week before. Hitler's informed. He requests an action plan to get this back online. They go back within the week and say, okay, we've got an idea. The boffins at Alket have got this other idea of a plan B. They've spoken to another manufacturer, Krupp, and Krupp agree that the plan is feasible. What Alket are proposing is to take the superstructure of the Sturmgeschütz and its gun and transplant that onto another tank chassis, the Panzer IV. And if we move to the next slide, the result is the so-called Sturmgeschütz IV. That then means that the other Sturmgeschütz that's been produced all these years is now renamed the Sturmgeschütz III to differentiate the two. And what you've got is literally a vehicle designed in record time. Literally from when the bombs stopped falling on the 26th of November through to the end of December, you've got about 4 or 5 weeks where the Alket guys come up with a design to actually get this onto Panzer IV chassis. You've got the buy-in from Krupp. You've got Hitler giving this the thumbs up. Not ideal, but it's the best he's going to get. And yes, it will give him lots of incremental vehicles, whereas there's not so many coming out of Alket. So this gets the thumbs up, and literally within 4 to 5 weeks, production of this brand new vehicle is coming out of the Krupp factory. It's a relatively straightforward technical solution, literally transplanting the superstructure and gun onto the chassis. The only real problem, the only real difference you've got is that the Panzer IV is longer. So there's a bit of a gap at the front where the superstructure should go, but it's further back. That presented them with a bit of a problem because the driver, who on the Sturmgeschütz III is within the superstructure, his position is further forward, it's outside of the superstructure. So they've got 2 choices. They can either re-engineer the steering, the transmission, and the internal part of the Panzer IV to move the driver back. That's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. They haven't got that time. So instead, they opt for the second solution, which is to build an armoured box around the driver's head, give him a couple of periscopes, and just hope that he's not too claustrophobic. If you look at the second photograph on the right, where that GI's left knee is the armoured box protruding from the front of the superstructure. And that really is, the only real main difference or the only real main problem they had to deal with. I mentioned in the second bullet point, it was a stopgap vehicle. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have built this variant of the Sturmgeschütz. It's only because they lost the capability, the capacity in the factory. But they carry on building them all the way through into April 45. The last 2 come out of the factory at Krupp in April 1945. So it's built for all of the well, effectively the end, until the end of the war. It's used mainly with infantry units along the lines of Sturmgeschütz III, mountain infantry units, normal infantry divisions, etc. They get the main benefit of the Sturmgeschütz IV. There are a few other units that do get it. Notably, in Normandy, you got the 17th SS Panzer Grenadiers get a complement of these vehicles. 90th Panzer Grenadier Division in Italy, and 4th and 5th SS Panzer Divisions in the East. I think they're the only armoured units that get this. Otherwise, it's effectively an infantry support vehicle. So that's the change of plan. And if we now overlay our graph with the extra howitzers and we put on a coffee-coloured layer of bars for the Sturmgeschütz IV, you can now see that that hole between that's created by the bombing of the Alket factory, some of that production is clawed back by bringing in the Sturmgeschütz IV. There's still a big hole in production. They lose about 600 to 700 vehicles out of the production cycle. They're gone forever. But you know, it takes them 5 to 6 months, and they're kind of back at the levels of production they were at before.
But presumably, that in order to increase production of this, they're having to let production of other vehicles or submarines or missiles or torpedoes go down, because the Germans at this point can't do everything. If they put resources in one place, they can't put it elsewhere. Is that a fair comment?
That is a fair comment. And to be quite honest, I've not looked into what the capacity issues were, if there were any in Krupp at the time. They were producing the Panzer IV. Did they lose Panzer IV production in favour of this? Quite possibly. The answer is I don't know.
People are asking about Panzer IV, Jagdpanthers, etc., etc. And I mean, again, it's another potential. As we said at the beginning, the potential spider's web of discussions from this one seemingly small subject is they are vast and many, and we'll be here all night if we go in every rabbit hole.
Oh, you know, literally, we could have done a whole week on the Sturmgeschütz.
Because 5 days, 5 models, we could do that, couldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to take this subject and say, okay, let's relate it to Tank Destroyer Week. Let's try and fit it in an hour and a quarter or so, and
there's going to be more than that. We're already an hour and 23, but yeah, it's fine.
Oh, right, okay. Right.
No, it's fine. It's our fault, and everybody's asking questions. I've just said we're going to ease off some of the questions because, but yeah, back to you.
Okay, so as I've mentioned, we've got the Sturmgeschütz on the graph now, the Sturmgeschütz IV, should I say. So we can now see that does contribute to clawing back some of the increased production. Forgotten what comes next. Okay, let's click the next slide and see what appears. Right. So we've touched upon the howitzer version. We've touched upon the reasons why the Sturmgeschütz IV arrives. If we think back to what Hitler wanted in 1942, 80 millimeters of armor on the front, they're talking about upgrading the Sturmgeschütz. They're also thinking about what's going to replace it in the future, because we don't know when the war's going to finish. We know the Soviets are going to be working on bigger, heavier tanks and all sorts of other vehicles. We better start thinking about a replacement for the Sturmgeschütz. That's what they start thinking about in 42. In 43, it starts to gel a bit. The idea gels, and they start to come up with more concrete ideas, such as we want thicker armor, 100 millimeters of effective armor at the front. They want 40, perhaps even 50 millimeters of armor at the side to do away with the armored side skirts, make these vehicles proof against the Soviet anti-tank rifle menace. They want to put a more effective gun on there because of these future Soviet heavier, bigger, nastier tanks. They go for the Panther gun, again, still a 7.5 centimeter gun, but it's an L70, longer, high velocity, very effective against enemy vehicles. So they want to put that on there. Because of this big gun, they're not going to be able to fit that very easily on a Panzer III chassis. They go for the Panzer IV. So it's going to be a Panzer IV chassis with thicker armor, this long gun, and they come up with a name for it. They call it the new model Sturmgeschütz, or Sturmgeschütze neue Art. They, 1943, build prototypes, they test them, put them through various trials, make various amendments, etc. So they arrive at the position where this thing is ready for production. And December 1943, they begin production of this vehicle. The first ones roll out the gates in January 1944, and things start to happen for this new Sturmgeschütz. It looks like this. And as I say, all's going swimmingly until the Inspector General of Armour Troops, General Guderian, takes a look at it and goes, "Nein, this is a tank hunter. This is, for me, this is not going to the artillery as a replacement Sturmgeschütz. This is to be going to the Panzer divisions." He wins the argument. He pulls rank, wins the argument, and these are deployed as tank destroyers or tank hunters, to use the German description. It's renamed, or it's named as the Jagdpanzer IV, the hunting tank 4, because it's on the Panzer IV chassis. The artillery lose this particular argument. But what I found fascinating with this vehicle is that the name Sturmgeschütz sticks with it for months and months and months. Just a couple of quick examples, bearing in mind that we are running late. The status report I showed you earlier for the 12th Panzer Division, that very same document for September 44, for the anti-tank battalion, shows this status of their anti-tank or the various vehicles which were available to them. They've got a mixture of Sturmgeschütz 3s, and they've got a vehicle which they term, or which is described as a Panzerjäger Sturmgeschütz 4. Effectively, it's a Jagdpanzer IV. They've just used this convoluted title because they know it's kind of a Sturmgeschütz vehicle. Likewise, there's a production planning document for the Sturmgeschütz type vehicles for 1943-44. This is from April 1944. It shows production up to March 44, and then the intended number of vehicles to be produced until the end of the year. And the yellow arrow is pointing out the fact that where it says Fertigung, or production, in brackets it says Sturmgeschütz, Sturmhaubitzer, and Sturmgeschütz neue Art. So even in April 1944, the central planning guys are looking at this and still including this as part of their Sturmgeschütz planning. I just found that rather interesting, the fact that even though it's clearly designated as a tank hunter, it's still kind of being treated as a assault gun. Oh, just one final thing. Obviously, as you can see there, it's got a shorter L48 gun. The L70 gun comes along later on in 1944, so it does indeed end up with a long gun. But this wasn't the first vehicle where Guderian had to put his foot down and say to the artillery, "Sorry, chaps." It happened literally a year beforehand. As part of the Tiger program, you had two companies competing for the contract, Henschel and Porsche. Porsche were confident they were going to get the gig. They thought they were going to get or be in the position of producing the Tiger tank. So they build 90 hulls, some say 91, of their version of the Tiger tank. Disappointingly for them, they lose the contract. Henschel gets the contract, but Porsche are now left with 90 hulls. Now, they want payment for these hulls, and they're due payment. So the army's got 90 hulls. What are they going to do with them? The answer, we're going to build heavy Sturmgeschütz. They put a heavily armoured casemate on the back. They put a very long 8.8 centimetre gun in, L71, capable of putting a hole through any known tank at the time. And it even goes as far as the artillery, assuming they're going to get these vehicles, they redesignate all of their Sturmgeschütz battalions as light Sturmgeschütz battalions, and they start planning 5 heavy Sturmgeschütz battalions. Now, it's around this time in early 43 that Guderian is nominated as Inspector General of the Armoured Troops. And probably the first problem he has to deal with is this. Walks into his office and probably utters the German equivalent of, "You've got to be bloody well joking." He overrules the decision. These vehicles are taken away from the artillery and they're given to, well, as we know, this becomes the Ferdinand, or later Elephant tank destroyer. It's allocated to the panzer troops and goes into action in the Battle of Kursk, and then later on as well. So that wasn't. This was the first time that Guderian has to turn around and put his foot down and make the decision. Tank destroyer, not Sturmgeschütz. But the Sturmgeschütz finally do get their hands on a long gun. The Sturmgeschütz crews. It takes until January 1945, mind, and they get their hands on 100 of these beasts. It was a stopgap kind of effort to get a long gun, a long L70 gun, into Panzer IV regiments. They realised that the L48 gun was kind of starting to show its age, not being able to put a hole in through the front of an IS-2. So they decided to come up with a version or a vehicle which did precisely that. So it had the Panther gun on it. They couldn't fit it in the Panzer IV turret, too small. So they put it in effectively what is a Jagdpanzer IV superstructure on top of a Panzer IV. It gets called the Panzer IV/70 L70 gun. A for Alket because they design it. They build only 277. 177 go to tank regiments which operate Panzer IVs, and it gives them this extra anti-tank capability. But the last 100 are given over to the Sturmartillerie, and they allocate their 100 amongst, I think it's 18 different Sturmgeschütz battalions, which by this time, we haven't got time to go into it, but then they're now redesignated as brigades rather than battalions to differentiate them. And they're used in action in the final 5 months of the war. At this time of the war, you've got a lot of chaos in vehicle production, vehicle distribution. And you even find Sturmgeschütz units, I think about half a dozen Sturmgeschütz battalions, are actually given Hetzers, the little Jagdpanzer 38s you see in the right-hand corner, which were only ever meant as tank destroyers. Between 50 and 100 are actually handed over in place of Sturmgeschützen. And it's kind of ironic in a way that whereas 2 years previously they're churning out lots of Sturmgeschütze, they're being given to everybody else, and at the end it's the Sturmgeschütz crews who end up being given tank destroyers. No more graphs, we've got a simple table of numbers here. If you look at that, that is a list of all vehicles which went into series production, so not just one-off prototypes or ones or twos. All vehicles which were used as tank hunters. And as you can see from the numbers produced, you go from 52 at the bottom to nearly 8,000 at the top. The Sturmgeschütz, more than 3 times as many Sturmgeschütz were built, or Sturmgeschütz 3s were built, than the next one on the list, the Hetzer. If you add in, as some people do, the howitzer version, the 1,311 units there, you're getting over 9,000 units. And a lot of people say, well, the Sturmgeschütz, with the howitzer and the gun, the most produced tracked armoured vehicle of Germany's war. Okay, it's true. Is that really important? Not too sure. But looking at the 3 Sturmgeschütz models put together, more Sturmgeschütz 3s, 4s and howitzers were built than all of the rest of them put together. So an incredible number were built in terms of volume. Was it the most effective? And we had the question earlier, did they really have 20k, 20,000 tank kills? Hard to say. It's possible there's some document in a dusty archive somewhere which tells us this, but there wasn't an office, a Sturmgeschütz office in Berlin, collating monthly reports of kills of enemy tanks by every Sturmgeschütz equipped unit in the armed forces. As far as I'm aware, that didn't exist, and that level of information probably isn't available. But what we do have, the Sturmartillerie did actually keep tabs on how many tanks their Sturmgeschütze were knocking out. And this kind of gives some backing, some support to that 20k figure, is that for the Sturmartillerie, their Sturmgeschütz battalions and batteries and brigades, as they became, from the start of Barbarossa until August 1944, so just over 3 years, they claimed over 18,262 tank kills on the Eastern Front alone. So doesn't count Northwest Europe, doesn't count Normandy, Italy, anywhere else, North Africa. Just 18,000 alone on the Eastern Front. So 20k, yeah, I think that's quite probable.
Okay.
Final slide. I'm going to leave you with this rather ironic thought, that what starts off as a humble infantry support vehicle, only supposed to take on tanks as a very last resort, ends up being Germany's most successful tank hunter. The end.
Yeah, it's that whole complex question of doctrine and use and availability, and then being used by commanders in a certain way, the enemy then reacting to them in a certain way that influences. Again, it's the rock paper scissors analogy, I think, is still making a lot of sense at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, if we just quickly go back here.
Yeah.
Out of, if we just look at the Sturmgeschütz 3 at the very top, ignore the 4 and the howitzer, nearly 8,000 were built. How many of those were designated tank destroyers? Well, they weren't. They were all Sturmgeschütz. You know, they were all designated as Sturmgeschütz. Some were used in place of tanks. Some were employed as purpose-built tank destroyers. By 1943, 44, 45, almost all of those Sturmgeschütze, regardless of whichever unit they were working in, were effective tank destroyers, because that's what was being thrown at them. So, you know, how many of those were tank destroyers? Probably most. Is probably the best answer you'll get, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll do a few questions if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So, Philip Blood, the renowned Dr. Philip Blood, is asking, I'm going to find it now. It may be a trick question. Who was the Wittmann of the StuGs? Or is the answer Wittmann because he started on StuGs?
Yeah. There were some aces, that, you know, on with the Sturmgeschütz units. I can't think of any off the top of my head. You know, my field is really more the technical side rather than the human side, and especially when we get into sort of controversial things like Panzer aces and stuff, I do tend to turn off slightly. But yes, there were some names associated.
I think Phil was being deliberately Phil there. This is an interesting one for me on the card there. The Sturmgeschütz seems to be a dead end from present military day vehicles. Is that fair?
I would say yes, it is fair. I mean, yeah, effectively the end of World War II, you know, that's kind of when the assault gun kind of stops evolving. It doesn't stop them being used. I mean, they were used in Suez. You know, Su-100s were used in Egypt by the Egyptians in Suez. You had, you know, after the war, you know, you even had Syria using Sturmgeschütz 3s in the 1967 conflicts. But as you know, they're just relics of.
Yeah, I was just saying, it's again, are they using them because they're effective, or are they using them because it's what they had available because they were being sold? And it's, yeah, again, it's the complexity of the frequency of use doesn't not necessarily indicate the choice of it being used. It's just that they're available.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of the assault gun does tend to die in 1945. A few relics motor on over the next 20 odd years, but that's about it. Nobody really carries on the concept of the assault gun. You even see some tank destroyers soldering on, but again, that's another branch that tends to die out.
So the last question really, and I know what the answer is going to be, is should there be more work into are we wasting our time trying to define precise roles for these vehicles? It's, as we said, it's an unanswerable question, and just look more specifically at how they were deployed, and in a particular example on a particular day on the Eastern Front or in Normandy or in Italy, here's what they did, how it was effective in this situation. Is it better looking at it like that than trying to do this broad kind of definitions job?
I would agree. I think it's the latter. You know, as humans, we always look for simple solutions to complex arguments, and there really isn't one here. You know, was the Sturmgeschütz an assault gun? Yes, it was. Was it a tank destroyer? Well, it was used as one, so yes, it was. Yeah. Was it a tank? Not really, but it was used as one, so maybe so.
I mean, if we could have a panel discussion with 10 StuG commanders, some had fought in the Eastern Front, some in Yugoslavia, some in France, and we asked them, describe what you see your vehicle as, they'd all be arguing amongst themselves about how they use it, because it would vary within a battalion, within an individual commander, how he saw his own role. You know, is that individual aggressive or defensive? Which terrain are they in? Who are they engaging? British, Canadians, Americans, Soviets? It's a really, really complex question. I think it reinforces the idea that just breaking down vehicle types is really fascinating. And with that, you can draw some conclusions. You can look, those graphs there are really good because you can make real conclusions from them. And that when you explain the drop off there and gave the reason for that, that is something you get. Yeah, there's a scientific approach to that. But this whole idea of when it's a tank destroyer, a tank, and when it's a tank destroyer, it's getting caught up in something that is basically an impossible question.
Yeah, personally, you know, looking back at, you know, vehicle history, looking back at the Second World War, I think there are much better questions to get involved with than this one, because, as you say, I don't think there really is a single simple answer to that.
Yeah, well, I think we'll leave it there. So, Pete, it's been great talking to you again, and we will invite you back again for another show. And people have loved it. And yeah, okay, a bit more than an hour and a bit, but it was a good hour and a bit, and we haven't addressed any more than about a third of the questions that were coming in, which is great. We can pick up some of these themes with the Chieftain on Thursday. Damien tomorrow has an even more complex, arguably, subject of Italian tank destroyers, when you have trucks and all sorts of lorry-mounted shit in there, which where the hell does that fall in the pie chart? But I'm looking forward to Damien's understanding of that. And then the Chieftain, it'll go off on whatever course it's going to go, talking about whatever the Chieftain wants to talk about and wherever the conversation goes. So it'll be really good. So, Pete, thanks very much. And thank everybody who's been asking about the support of the channel in terms of finances. Yes, a few more patrons would be fantastic. Yes, a few more YouTube channel members would be fantastic. And also just spread the word among people. It's amazing. I still get emails saying, I didn't know your channel existed. Someone told me about it last week. The algorithm doesn't seem to be favoring me for whatever reason. But I welcome every one of you. And it's just for me to say thank you very much for watching, everybody. And I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.